Okay, so Phil, you should be able, yep, perfect. Okay, so Phil was born and raised on a Pipestone area sheep farm and continues to work with his family's sheep operation. He graduated with an animal science degree from South Dakota State University and received a master's in animal and range science from North Dakota State University. After receiving his master's degree, Phil worked for the North Dakota State University Research Center in Hettinger, North Dakota. After 6 years with that research center, he returned to Pipestone, where he was employed by the University of Minnesota Extension in Pipestone County for 11 years. They raise Suffolk sheep and Red Angus cattle. Phil began his role as a lamb and wool instructor at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in June of 2005. Take it away, Phil.
All right, sorry about that. I was just trying to figure out how to unmute myself. Can you hear me fine?
Yep.
Yes, you're doing great, Phil.
All right, sounds good. Well, I'm excited to be on the webinar today with you. Several people that are in the audience I've worked with previously. I know Troy, I've worked with Troy in the past, and also with Travis Hoffman. That's pretty exciting that you guys are doing this, and I'm very happy to share with you some of my thoughts. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is that, boy, this is really a good time to have some sheep on our farms and to have goats on our farms. The economics of that has been fantastic this year. We've seen record high prices that we probably we have never seen before, and may not see again for a while. As we look into the future, it is, and in our area, and maybe I should step back a little bit and tell you a little bit about our program first, is the Pipestone Lamb and Wool program is what I do for a living. Is I'm an instructor there, and we work with about 110 to 120 producers, primarily in southwestern Minnesota, into South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa. We do reach out farther than that as well, but that's where we work with most of our producers. And I consider my job as kind of multiple faceted. One, it's an educational component to that. We are part of Minnesota West Community and Technical College, and so there's an educational component with that. And then there's also what I would say there is some service where we help producers as well as some consulting. And so it's kind of a multifaceted approach that we work with. The producers I work with have anywhere from probably 50 ewes to over 1,000 ewes. And so a wide range. They're probably marketing somewhere around 30 to 40,000 lambs annually. And so again, very, very exciting to be in the sheep business right now. A lot of economic advantages in terms of because of the market. And probably no matter what you did this last year, even if you overfed and had low production rates, you probably could make money in the sheep. Now, unfortunately, as we move forward, I'm looking at the feed costs specifically, and that's one of the major components that we look at in terms of our risk management approach of raising sheep, is our feed costs are going to be higher, driven by the drought, driven by high corn and soybean prices. Probably our biggest hindrance is going to be those individuals that are feeding hays, grass hays and alfalfa hays, because we had less production in much of the region that I'm working in. And so I'm going to kind of focus in on ways that we can try to keep our feed costs, moderate our feed costs. They're still going to be higher than they were previously because of the costs, but that we're going to see. But that's what I'm going to focus some of my presentation on, and I'm very happy to answer any questions as well. The other thing that is very important, and I'm not really going to address it much in this presentation, is the production level. And whether you're raising goats or whether you're raising sheep, we need to be marketing a high percentage of product. And that becomes very important. And nutrition plays a role in that, as well as genetics and management. And so we can't lose sight of that production level. And we focus a lot of that, our time, on production level. But this presentation, I'm been asked to talk more on sheep nutrition. The first thing that I like to start off with is kind of knowing the nutritional requirements. And so it's just as important to know what to feed the sheep, but also when to feed the sheep, these different types of feeds. And so if we feed the ewes the same diet year round, or goats, or even cattle, we're probably costing ourselves more money. And so understanding what the requirements are for the ewes or nannies is very important. And I am just going to focus on the sheep side of it, but it would apply to other species as well. And so this table has come from the NRC, or the Nutrient Requirements of Sheep. It's an older table. It was developed in 1985. There is an updated 2007, but it hasn't really changed a whole lot. And this one, to me, is a little user-friendly for someone old like me. And so this is what I'm going to use as a starting point. The things that I'm going to look at primarily are how many days I'm going to be feeding each of these different diets. That's really important, because I can tell you right off the bat, our most expensive diet is our lactation diet, and we're feeding that for about 40 days. Probably one of our cheaper diets is our maintenance and early gestation diets, which is about 255 days. And so that's probably 255 days. That's probably an area that we can probably have the most economic impact, because it's such a long time period. And then we have our flushing at 40 days. So that's something that we look at. We encourage our producers to look at each of those stages and plan ahead to know what requirements they need, but also what quantities of different types of feedstuffs they need as well for that length of time period. And so that's where the days fall into place there. The dry matter intake is an estimate of what they are able to consume. And we'll have some more discussion on that as we go through this presentation. But the maintenance time period, we're at about 3 pounds. And again, this is for 154 to 176 pound ewe. The two things that I focus in primarily on the nutrition side is TDN, and TDN is energy, and crude protein, or CP, is our crude protein. And so those are the two primary things that I look at. Obviously, we need to look at other nutrients. Water is one of them that we can never overlook. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but if we don't provide plenty of fresh, clean water to our ewes or to our lambs as they're growing, our performance is not going to be as good, because if they aren't drinking water, they're not going to consume as much feed. They're not going to be as productive. And so fresh, clean water is a huge, huge nutrient that we cannot overlook. The other two nutrients that are out there that, again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on is minerals. And for the most part in sheep production, we're providing a trace mineral salt. So it's basically a salt with a few trace minerals, and we're providing that year round to the ewes. And figuring about 1/4 ounce per head per day consumption is what we're using. So it's primarily a salt with a few trace minerals in it. Important to note that it needs to be for sheep, specifically in the sheep world, because many of the other trace mineral salts will have copper in it. And in goats, we probably need more copper, but we tend to have more problems with copper toxicity in sheep. And so we want to make sure that our trace mineral salt to meet the mineral requirements is specifically for sheep, and we don't add any additional copper unless we're in a deficient area. The The other area is vitamins. And again, I'll touch on that just real briefly. And really one of the things, and Troy brought it up in the discussion earlier, that we're looking at when we think about vitamins is we need to provide some level of vitamins. Grass, when they're out on pasture, is an excellent source of vitamins. And so we need to know time periods that we're going to be potentially deficient. And so during the growing season, if they're out on pasture, we're not too concerned. If we're feeding a lot of older crop hay, we're going to be a little bit more concerned. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. So the other thing I wanted to point out on this table that I think is really important to look at is what is the typical energy. And so I'll start at maintenance. We're at 1.5 to 1.6 pounds of TDN. What does that mean when we're looking at different feedstuffs? Well, on small ruminants, we feed a lot of forage. Typically, our dry forage is about 50% energy or TDN. And so what that maintenance time period at 1.5 means is that we're feeding about 3 pounds of about any type of dry hay, and we're going to probably meet their energy requirements. Okay. When we look at lactation, which is our highest requirement time period, we're going to have to increase the quality of our forage so that they would consume more of that, as well as add higher energy feed intakes, such as corn, which is closer to 80% energy versus 50%. And so to reach those, and so having an understanding of the requirements of our energy is very important. One of the other things on the energy standpoint, the NRC numbers that are listed here, they're all NRC except for this flush 200% of maintenance. And we've been starting to flush at a higher level. We're targeting somewhere between the NRC and 200% of maintenance on an energy basis. And so what that means is that we need to be feeding a much higher energy requirement for maintenance, or for flushing, excuse me. Flushing is the 2 to 3 week time period before they are turned out with rams or bucks. And we're seeing a big response. There's some research out of Michigan that is where we've got this information from and are starting to utilize that. And we're seeing a good response. When we do this, we're going to get more eggs ovulating and we're going to get a higher production. And so that's the TDN, that's the energy side of it. Throughout the year, as different stages of production, crude protein also has a big bearing. And so our lowest is going to be in our early gestation and our maintenance time period, where we're at about 1/4 of a pound, which if our grass hay has 10% protein and we're feeding 3 pounds of it, we're going to meet that requirement for both those stages of production. And so that's just a gauge. When we get into lactation, we need almost a whole pound of energy, and that means we need to feed higher protein feedstuffs such as alfalfa hay or dried distillers or soybean meal to get to that higher level. I look at protein during lactation. If we limit our protein, we're going to start limiting some of our milk production, and so that is key for milk production for us. This is just more of a graphic way of looking at it as we go throughout the year. And we do many short courses with the program that I'm involved with. And to me, the important part of this table is to say, we need to, and this is all based on energy for different stages of production. If we need to be feeding them different levels of energy based on their stage of production. If we're feeding them the same amount year round, that is going to cost us more money, and we're going to have lower performance. We're going to be overfeeding them at some time periods and potentially underfeeding them at other time periods, and consequently, it's going to be a more expensive diet. In addition, if we don't see these fluctuations occurring, just like in the flushing where we're increasing that plane of nutrition so they ovulate more eggs, if we're level and maintain the same nutrition throughout the year, we're not going to get that response, and that's going to have a reduction in our overall performance. And so again, we want to see some changes in terms of our nutrition as we go out throughout the year. And so that's very, very important for us to be looking at. In addition to that, we have different body condition scores that we want to be looking at. Body condition scores on sheep, we have a scoring system from 0 to 5. 5 being obese, 0 being very thin. And so when our ewe is in maintenance or as a dry ewe, we want it to be somewhere in that 1.5 to 2. And right before lambing, we want to have that body condition score the highest at 3.5 to 4. And then through lactation, they're naturally, even if we're feeding them the requirements, they're naturally going to burn off some of that body condition, and they're going to be weaned off at about a body condition score of 2 to 2.5. And so again, just like our energy requirements changes throughout the year, we want to see their body condition score change throughout the year. Those go hand in hand. That is how we increase some of our performance. As I pointed out earlier, we're looking at ways to reduce our feed costs, our projected feed costs for this next year. I'm anticipating for our program members that our feed cost is going to be somewhere around $115 to $140 is what it's going to cost us. Last year and was we were probably in that $75 to $85 range. The year before, we probably were even lower than that. And so we're approaching almost double our feed costs. And so everything we can do to manage our feed costs is going to be very important. The nutrients we're looking at, I talked about earlier: water, energy, protein, minerals, and vitamins. I'm going to focus mainly on energy and protein. So when energy feeds, I help to coach a quiz bowl team, a 4-H quiz bowl team, and we talk about energy feeds and protein feeds. And so when I think of energy feeds, those are feedstuffs that we're feeding specifically to add more energy. And so these are some examples. So dried distillers, a pile of dried distillers, that's a high energy feed. Below that is our oats or other small grains. Those are all energy feeds. Corn in the middle, that is our primary energy feed in southwestern Minnesota. Readily available and is a very readily available and is an excellent energy feed. Right below that is a pelleted feed, and we're using a lot of these. These are soybean hulls, pelleted soybean hulls. The reason they pellet them is because of the density of loose soy hulls. We can't transport as many tons, and so it's not as efficient. So we pellet them, and we are feeding quite a bit of that, and I'll talk more about that. The two on the right are also energy feeds. Grass hay is considered an energy feed as well. It's not going to be as nutrient dense in terms of energy as any of the others I've talked about, but it is considered an energy feed. And then below that is corn silage or a silage, and typically that is one of our cheaper energy feeds. Unfortunately, if we don't have a large enough size operation, we really can't utilize it. And so probably the two primary or 2 to 3 primary energy feeds that I look at, corn and corn silage, are probably our cheapest ones, and the grass hay would be the next one. When I think about protein feeds, really there is a lot of protein feeds, but primarily the protein feeds that I'm dealing with are going to be dried distillers grain, soybean meal, and alfalfa hay. And in sheep production, small ruminant production, boy, that alfalfa hay for years and years and years has always been the foundation of our protein. What I've seen in the last 15 to 20 years is that each year we're having a harder time getting good alfalfa hay. The availability and or cost. And so we're still using alfalfa as a primary feed ingredients for our protein source, but we're finding ways to find other protein sources, whether that's soybean meal or dried distillers, in combination with alfalfa hay. And this year in particular, our alfalfa, we had good quality alfalfa put up, but probably not as many tons. And so we're not going to have enough. And so we're going to have to be looking at other alternative protein sources. Feed composition. And boy, it was great to hear someone talking about analyzing our feedstuffs, because that is crucial to know how to feed and not overfeed or underfeed our ewes. And so these are typical book values, but we encourage our producers, and I would say every day I'm getting feed samples in from producers that they've tested, and they're trying to evaluate how they can utilize that feedstuffs. We probably have focused primarily on our forages, and that was talked about earlier. We probably have the most variability because of the environmental conditions, as well as varieties, types of forages. We probably see the most variation in those. But we're also testing corn grain for protein, because we're feeding our lambs out, and the book value is at 9% crude protein. But boy, our average, if I'm buying through a feed mill and I don't know my protein on my corn, I'm going to be calling it about 7%. We've had more producers sending their grain samples the last couple of years, because that cheapens up our ration. We need a little less protein in there, depending on how our corn tests out. And so we're starting to do a little bit of that. If you're buying everything from the feed mill, boy, I'm using 7%. Troy or Travis might give you a different number, but that's the number that I'm using, rather than this book value. But these are book values that give you a gauge. Again, our grains are 76 to 90% energy or TDN. Corn silage on a dry matter basis at 72, so it's kind of intermediate, and our forage is around that 50 to 60% TDN. Okay, so more nutrient dense energy sources down here, in terms of that. Protein wise, our real high proteins are dried distillers and soybean meal. Alfalfa hay, we can see that up into 20, 22, 24. I saw some samples yesterday. And so again, if you have 24% alfalfa hay based on your forage analysis, that helps so that you don't have to feed as much of that alfalfa, and helps to stretch that alfalfa out. So these are just some book table values, and it's just can't emphasize enough that forage sampling and getting analysis done is crucial. And so I'm glad you had a speaker on that. The other thing and so those are kind of the requirements. Those are kind of some base values of what each of those feedstuffs might have. But the other thing we need to look at is price. If we can get corn at $200 a ton versus soybean hulls at $200 a ton, which is my better purchase, And so that's why I look at using a price per pound of nutrient. And I'll give some examples of both energy and protein. And so right now we're paying somewhere around $5.75 per bushel for corn. And so I list that in there. If we had more time, I would try to poll you and say, okay, which one of these, whether it's alfalfa hay, grass hay, soy hulls, dry distillers, or corn silage, is the cheapest source of energy on a price per pound of nutrient basis? And I'd have you poll, and I've done that with classes, and it's interesting how people pick different numbers. The reality is that all of these, based on the book values that I showed you previously, are at the same cost per pound of energy or same cost per pound of TDN. And so the way we use this table, or the way I use this table, is I use corn as my base because that's what I can get. It's readily available at $5.75. If I can get dried distillers for less than $218 a ton, or soybean hulls for less than $185 a ton, I'm going to buy that instead of corn as my energy source. And so I can use that, or at least I'm going to buy part of that and provide part of that as my energy source. And so that gives me a gauge to what the cost per pound of nutrient is. So if I need more energy in my diet, I can look at this and say, if I can get soybean hulls for $150 a ton, that might be the source or the direction I want to go. Okay. Currently, locally for me, going through a feed elevator, and if I was to look at this, I cannot buy alfalfa hay for $137. I cannot buy grass hay that my ewes are going to eat for $130. So corn is a better option for me. Soy hulls, I cannot, it's close to about that price, but if I'm buying it through a local elevator, I'm probably paying $200 a ton. So that is not my cheaper source of energy. Dried distillers, USDA prices are below that, but if going through a different feed mill, you might see prices higher than that. If you could buy a semi-load of it, you probably can get it cheaper. Corn silage may or may not be able to buy that cheaper. That's pretty close to the same as what I would have corn priced at. Okay, so that's one component of looking at alternatives is the price per pound of nutrient. We also need to look at, okay, we can't feed a ewe 100% of her diet corn. There's some risks involved with that. We still need some forages in there. And so we need to balance our rations. But if we have a ration out there and we're needing an extra half a pound of energy, this helps us to determine how to provide that. The other one would be crude protein. On crude protein, again, these are all the same. And so right now, good alfalfa hay, I'm going to pay about $200 a ton for it. That's comparable to $118 for grass hay. Can't buy grass hay for that. Grass hay typically isn't a protein feed, and so we really wouldn't think of that as a good option anyways. $143 for soy hulls. I told you earlier, $185 to $200 so that's not a very good source. $200 a ton alfalfa hay is comparable to $350 a ton dried distillers. I get dried distillers for somewhere between $200 to $250. That's probably a pretty good option. And I need to look at how can I implement that if I need more protein into my diet. Same way as soybean meal. Soybean meal I can get cheaper than $590, quite a bit cheaper than $590. And so again, that's where we're looking at. If I have to go out and find the alfalfa, I might be paying $200 a ton or more for it. I might be able to ration my alfalfa that I have and use some dried distillers and soybean meals as an alternative. And so that's a price per pound of nutrient basis. And I think that's very important to be looking at. The other thing that, this is just a table that goes through that calculation. I'm not going to go through that today. This is being recorded. So if people wanted to look how we calculated that, this gives an example of how that is calculated. And so you can go through and look at that on your own time. But that's very important calculation in doing that. Other considerations when we're looking at our feeding system, obviously the availability and price. And so corn in our area is available almost any place. And so and the price is pretty consistent from place to place. That might not be the same in every location that people are online. The other thing, we price a lot of our soybean hulls and dried distillers on a semi-load lot. There's economics of the scale that we're doing. And so if we're going through a feed mill and buying dry distillers and soybean hulls and only buying a ton of it, they have to warehouse that. They have to have a storage area for it. And they're probably going to mark that up $20 to $40 a ton just because they have to handle it. And I don't think that's wrong of them. I don't think that's wrong of them, but we can buy it cheaper, just like they would buy it cheaper by the semi-load and bring it in. The other thing, from an availability standpoint, local feed mills only have so many compartments or areas that they can bring in different alternative feedstuffs. And so they may or may not have some of the ones that I'm talking about. Storage and handling becomes important consideration when we're talking about any of our feedstuffs, how we feed them and the labor and the facilities, and then a little bit on safety and transition I was hoping to talk about. So storage and handling. Again, this gets back to the economics of size. If we're putting up silage for sheep, I'm encouraging people to put them in bags. We have better quality forages put up in a bag. But for us to keep that feed fresh in the silage, we need somewhere close to 400 ewes so that we are pulling off about a foot of that face of that silage bag every day. And so that keeps that fresh. And so if we don't have, if we're not going to use about a foot of that space, I kind of discourage producers from using that because it's harder to keep it fresh. And we run into some other issues, specifically listerosis, when we feed corn silage. We have a lot of people that do feed corn silage. We have a few that do put it in piles, but most are putting it in a bag. Commodity sheds, whether we do save on dollars and is a way to storage. We grind a lot of our hay when we're limit feeding it. Sometimes it's piled outside. We live within the environment and it does snow and rain. And when that happens, we lose some of the quality of that forage can deteriorate. Where if we have a commodity shed, there's economics in place to have that a commodity shed to put those different forages in and or grains. And then bulk bins also gives us some flexibility, or if we're getting a semi-load in, we need enough bulk storage so that we can handle getting a semi-load in at a time. And so storage and handling becomes very important. If we only have 10 ewes, that storage and handling system might be totally different. It might be some big drums. It might be a gravity flow wagon in your shed, and that works very good. Way of storing some of those different feed things. But we need to be thinking about that, especially if we're looking at alternative feeds, how we're going to handle and store them. The feeding systems, and this is really a big area from my standpoint, is that we can see 20, 30, 40% wastage based on our feeding systems. And we can have efficient feeding systems for small operators as well as large operators. One of my pet peeves are two of these pictures here where we're feeding big round bales. I have a brother that is on the road a lot, and that's the way he's going to feed because it's a convenience. He's gone for a week at a time. He can put a bale out. He knows the animals will be fed, and somebody can drive by and quickly check, make sure they're fed and they're in, and everything's good. But when we do that, there's a tremendous amount of waste, and that's going to increase our costs substantially. And at a minimum, I'm looking at increasing that cost by 20%. That they're going to overconsume and or waste 20. And I think we can be in excess of 50%. If we have no feeding system or no feeder around a big round bale like the picture here is showing, they can waste a lot. One of the ways that we've tried to minimize that waste is to limit the time that they have access to that feed. And that helps to reduce some of our wastage. For that to work, they all have to have access to consume feed at the same time. And so that is one way that we have used to maintain or minimize some of our wasting. And we're using as a starting point about 2 hours a day that they have access to feed. And on higher quality forages, that might be less time. On poor quality forages, it might be more time. But 2 hours is where we're at. The other two pictures are self feeders. The one is a ground hay self feeder, less wastage, but there still is some wastage. But that reduces labor, but that's just another feeding system. Majority of the producers I work with are limit feeding, and so they're feeding them based on their requirements and adjusting those requirements for weather conditions and stages of production. And so they're adjusting that and body condition score. So if they're a little thinner than they want, they might put a little more energy into that diet, but they're limit feeding, providing them that feed, and they'll clean that feed up in a 2 to 6 hour time period. And so, or throughout the day. Silage, it might be a little bit longer. So these are just some examples, whether you're feeding in a fence line bunk, whether it's an in-pen bunk that you're taking a feed wagon down, or a feeding system, fence line feeding system. So I'm at 35 minutes, so I probably need to be wrapping it up a little bit. I got 2 slides that I kind of want to end on. And one is safety and transition. And so obviously, I've talked about a lot of different things. And the main point on safety that I need to tell you is that, if we price the cheapest source of energy as corn, we cannot feed the whole diet to sheep of corn. They're still ruminant animals. They need some forage in their diet. And so that's a nutritional thing that we need to make sure that we don't overlook. And so we have to use some common sense on what we're feeding. Acidosis is a concern, and acidosis is caused by high starch feeds such as corn or other grains that have a lot of starch in them. And so we need to transition that slowly. When we add a pound of corn, for example, we might do that over a week or 10 days rather than just doing it abruptly. And so acidosis and bloat are 2 nutritional disorders that we need to be very cautious on. Other deficiencies and toxicities, copper imbalance. For the most part, we need to be watchful of copper. A lot of our feed ingredients have some copper in them, and we don't want to be putting a lot of extra copper in there. Calcium deficiency or hypocalcemia is a concern. Alfalfa is really good in calcium. And I didn't point that out. A lot of our byproduct feeds are lower in calcium. Corn is lower in calcium. And so at certain stages, lactation and late gestation, there's a higher calcium requirement, and we need to be watching for that. Pregnancy toxemia is an energy-based problem, metabolic problem in sheep where they're not getting enough energy, and they start using their own body reserves to meet their energy requirements, and we need to just watch that. And so making sure that we're matching the requirements. Urinary calculi is a calcium phosphorus imbalance. White muscle disease is a vitamin E selenium challenge. And so those are some things from a safety and transition that I would want to be concerned with. The last slide that I'm going to show you today is kind of our current nutritional concerns. And so this gets back into just some of the things that I'm looking at and that I want to make sure people are cautious on. One is a calcium level. And we talked about that earlier. Low calcium feeds, corn, dried distillers, corn stalks, corn silage. And I told you earlier that corn silage might be one of our cheapest feedstuffs. And so when we're feeding a lot of corn silage, we need to be cautious and make sure that we're providing calcium when calcium is needed. So that becomes very important. If we have some alfalfa in our diets, even a pound of alfalfa, that's going to solve most of our calcium requirements. And so again, I'm seeing less alfalfa in our sheep diets, more corn silage, more grass hays, more corn stalks, dried distillers and corn, and a little less alfalfa. And so then that's an area of concern that we need to be watching. The vitamin E level. And so someone asked the question, what happens over time with the vitamin levels in our forages? Typically, you're not going to get a vitamin analysis on your forage. One, it's probably more expensive, but two, that vitamin level changes. You could test it and come back 6 months later and it's going to be at a different level. And so typically the concern I have is old crop hay, over a year old, weathered hay, crop residues, corn silage, they're all low in vitamin E. And so when I'm feeding a lot of those, especially if I'm doing dry lot year round and they're not getting out onto pasture, I'm going to be more concerned with vitamin E levels. The last one that I want to talk about is bulky feeds. And we're going to see, because hay prices are really high, we're going to see some feedstuffs that are cheaper. I have an analysis of 3 samples that a producer just sent me, and I'm concerned on all of them that the ewe is simply not going to be able to consume enough of that feed. And so I use NDF as a guide to the bulkiness of that forage. Ultimately, we want to monitor how much they can actually consume. And so 154 to 176 pound ewe, here's the dry matter intake. And I'm using 1% of the NDF number in terms of dry matter intake. So when NDF is at 40, that means that they can consume 3.85 to 4.4 pounds of dry matter intake. Okay, so that this is just an estimate, it's a gauge. And so a lot of our forages that are at 40 are going to be really good, lush alfalfa. Okay, if we provide some straw out there, and some of our straws and CRP hay, for example, is going to be closer to 80 NDF, maybe 70 to 80 NDF. What that means is that they're only going to be able to eat 1.9 to 2.2 pounds of dry matter intake. And as I mentioned earlier, if we need them to eat 3 pounds, then they're only going to get about 67% of their energy requirements from that forage if it's that high of an NDF. And so that's how I use that NDF. I think there's a lot of forages out there that they just, sheep in particular, won't eat or won't eat enough of, even if we grind it up. And so that's a concern, and I use NDF as a guide. And again, that gets back to that forage analysis. So I'm going to end with that. I've talked 40 minutes. I had a few more slides I'm going to skip by, and I'll answer any questions that you might have.
All right, Phil, I have a couple questions here for you. The first is, what target ratio of calcium and phosphorus would you recommend aiming for in feeding goats? And does this change with life stage?
So the place that we have the most concern is our males. And the target is 2 to 1, 2 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus or greater. So more calcium is all right, but 2 to 1 is the target.
Okay. In our breeding program, we feed a mineral with alpha-4 and elevated zinc prior to breeding to aid in cycling. Then we transition to a stock cow mineral for the duration of the year. Is there a mineral blend that can do this for our sheep? And are there any studies out there that have been done on mineral blends for sheep?
Excellent question. One of the things that I'd be concerned about is your stock, your cattle stock. And I apologize, was this goats or sheep?
Sheep.
Sheep. So I would be concerned about the copper levels potentially in your cattle stock that you're feeding. There are several companies that do have specifically a trace mineral salt, and generally, so that's primarily a salt with a few trace minerals. That's what I would recommend. Many times when we get into a mineral, that mineral is going to have more calcium and phosphorus. And probably the biggest concern, 2 concerns I have with that, it adds both calcium and phosphorus. And so we see more risks to our male animals, wethers and rams, when we do that. in terms of urinary calculi, and usually their consumption is higher on those on that as well. So I'm not sure I answered that exactly the way they wanted to. I think the zinc is a good trace mineral to put in. We have that in our trace mineral salt that we provide year round as well. So.
All right. Do you maintain the higher flushing ration through the entire breeding season?
Well, that is a great question, and it's a question that many of our producers are asking as well. The benefit of that is for the 2 to 3 weeks prior to, the biggest benefit is 2 to 3 weeks prior to turning the rams out. I tend to like to continue that for a couple weeks into the breeding season, because the majority of the ewes will get bred right away. And then I'm going to go back to the NRC requirements. And so typically the way that has worked for our program members is that they're going to be, what they're going to be feeding is close to 2 pounds of grain for that to get to 200% of maintenance, and their forage. And usually that's an alfalfa grass mix. And they'll do that for the 2 to 3 weeks prior to turn the rams out, and probably continue that for another 2 weeks into the breeding. And then they're probably going to slowly bring out some of that corn and get back to about 1 pound of corn. So
thank you, Phil.
The biggest benefit is going to occur before we turn the rams out. Once we turn the rams out, if they're cycling right away, we're not going to see as much of the benefit to continue to feed that all the way through that breeding.
Thank you, Phil, for all of your knowledge and answering those questions. I know there's a couple more. We aren't going to be able to get to those because we're getting short on time here, but I'm going to turn this over to Colleen. And our panelists today are Phil, Laura, and Troy. And so Colleen has just a couple of questions that she's going to ask you guys and to discuss for our viewers today. Go ahead, Colleen.
So if you, not only this year, but over the years, what has been your experience with alternative feedstuffs? Maybe give some example of some things that you've fed and some alternatives that we could consider. And I know, Phil, you've mentioned, depending on the scale, you can consider different feedstuffs, but just share briefly some of the experiences you've had with alternative feedstuffs.
Well, I'll start if nobody's going to start. And I might go to a slide here. Let's see. You can still see my slides? Yes. Yep. So the alternative feed stuff that's probably made the biggest impact on the program members that I work with is soybean hulls. It's a high energy feed. It has a good calcium to phosphorus ratio. Sheep really like it. It's a very safe feed. We use it a couple of places. We'll use it in the lambing jugs, where we basically self-feed them in the lambing jugs. It reduces labor and the need for making small square bales of alfalfa hay. The sheep like it, and we can transition from a corn alfalfa mix back to a corn to soy hulls and back to a corn alfalfa mix very easily. And so we might feed them in the jug 2 to 3 days, and then go back to the corn alfalfa mix with minimum risk. Probably the biggest risk is that ewes initially will choke on pelleted ones, and so we're grinding those pellets if we're feeding them in that fashion. If we're the other way we use that is if we're trying to put weight on real rapidly, or if we shear our ewes and we say, oh my gosh, it's going to be zero out and I don't have them up on much corn, we can put a whole bunch of soy hulls out there very quickly, and it's not going to change, or we're not going to have any nutritional problems. And so really works as a good feed stuff for us. So.
Troy, and I should introduce Troy Salzer. He is a veteran extension educator who currently is in St. Louis County and feeds a number of sheep and goats himself, and works with pastures and forages. So Troy, welcome. And do you have anything to add about some of the experiences that you've had with alternative feedstuffs?
So much of what both Laura and Phil have talked about in regards to the importance of testing, being aware of what your ultimate goals are for these products, I think are really, really critical. In our region, feed stuffs are in very short supply, especially in regards to forage particularly. I think that Phil's perspective was extremely good. We can't just price things strictly on price per pound of nutrient, because in this case, corn and soybean meal, or corn and distillers, would be probably some of our best options on a price per pound of nutrient. We still have to feed those animals some quantity of forage to keep their guts working correctly. And so that's when we get into situations where we have to feed other very non-conventional sort of approaches, such as things like even ground corn stalks, soybean straw, regular small grain straws, even looking at being able to harvest and utilize some of our cover crops if there's enough quantity out there in relationship to harvesting winter rye, oats. All of those things can actually have really good quality along those lines, and if put up right, can be as good as grass hay and otherwise. With CRP hay and all of these different products, be aware of any weeds that you might be importing as well. So think about that. Where is it coming from? Especially CRP hay. It had to be put up late, so most likely you are importing weed seeds in that particular case. So take that into consideration.
And well, Palmer amaranth would be one of those, but, and like you said, how many, how many thistle seeds you want to spread around the farm, and via the manure, the output, eventually too. Are there additional storage concerns for some of these alternative feedstuffs? For instance, freshness, and how should it be covered?
So in relationship to that, Colleen, I think that storage is really critical. How are you going to handle that feed? So many of these products, like Phil had mentioned, bringing them in with a semi. Do you have the appropriate equipment to unload that semi? Can you? Is that reasonable? What sort of shrink are you going to get in that process? All of those things are really important to think about, because even though it might be financially cheaper, it might still ultimately on a per pound basis, but because of shrink, for example, it actually might be more expensive. And that's where with Phil's commodity shed that he had a photo of might be a really good option if you're thinking about utilizing something for the long run. Recently, I've done a lot of work with one of the farmers that I work with on potatoes. Well, that took a tremendous amount of effort for him to make potato silage. So it's got to pay off, and it's got to be cheap enough if that can work. That wasn't for sheep and goats, but that was more for beef cattle in his particular situation. So.
Yep, and we have time for a couple of questions here, but the first one, especially in relation to alternative feedstuffs, What kind of behaviors do we need to be watching for when we feed alternative feedstuffs? And can you give us an example of like how they sorting and the boss cow or the boss ewe not letting the younger animals eat from the feed bunk, that kind of stuff? Phil or Troy, you want to address that? Or even Brent, Laura, you might have some experience with that on your farm too.
I would say, you know, anytime you're using a feed or a forage that you're not used to, potentially there may be some behavioral types of things depending on, I'll say, palatability or smell. I mean, we all know goats specifically, I'm going to speak from the goat side of things, you know, are fairly finicky eaters. And so even, you know, this doesn't only apply to alternative forages. It could definitely be a load of feed. You know, it could be the concentrate or whatever that you feed. We had an experience at one point where there was some additive that was used in another feed carried over into the batch of feed that we received. And it didn't change the nutrient values on the goats. It didn't harm the goats in any way, but the smell alone was enough to basically turn the does off and not want to eat, you know, and then of course, then there was fines and those types of things. So the same thing would apply, especially to something like an ensiled forage that you hadn't ensiled before. You know, maybe it acts a little bit different as it's, you know, going through the ensiling process. Maybe you know, that change in itself could cause the animals to, you know, drop in their intake levels, potentially hang back a little bit, you know, those types of things. You know, unfortunately, if we ever got to the point where, let's say you know, it would be later on in the time frame, you know, when Phil kind of talked about stages of life and lactation and gestation, but potentially if you ended up, you know, if we were earlier in the year and you were feeding this stuff before breeding season, you might have seen, you know, potentially could see a delay in, you know, breeding or conceptions, you know, if there was an issue with potentially toxins or, you know, molds or something like that. But for the time of year that we're speaking in now, I don't think you're not going to experience that now. You're sort of past that point. So.
Okay. And then one question from the chat box. Do you know if alfalfa meal is prone to harboring higher levels of mycotoxins or mold than soybean meal as an additional protein source?
I would think that, you know, it would be a dry product. So I would think that the risk would be low. That's a sort of a wide range kind of question there, but I would think that the range, you know, the opportunity for that would be low, being a fairly dry product. And usually an alfalfa meal is something that is a purchased product versus something that's being harvested out of the field, which is where we'd be more prone to experiencing those types of situations. So I guess that's my answer.
Okay. Any, we're gonna kind of wrap it up here as it just hit 12 noon here. Phil, Troy, or Laura, anything you want to add, insights on alternative feedstuffs?
I guess the other thing that I would bring up is that there's a lot of things that sheep and goats and cattle will eat. And so when you're looking at alternative feedstuffs, start out slow, start out at, you know, with you know, 10 to 20% rather than trying to feed the whole thing, and see how that works before you dive into it heavily. And so I would encourage people. And the other thing that, you know, the other experience that I had is I remember 10 years ago, feed costs were really high. And I had a producer that called me and said, you know, I just got a great deal. I just bought a semi-load of dry distillers. And he goes, how do I feed it? I mean, he didn't even think about the process of what he was going to do with it and whether he needed it or not. He just thought it was a good buy. And so make sure you have your ducks in a row and what you're going to do, how you're going to house it, how you're going to feed it. And do reach out to Troy or to Laura or myself and get our experiences so that you come a little bit more prepared.
Okay, I want to thank our panelists today, Troy, Laura, and Phil. You've done an excellent job, and we want to thank everybody for participating today. You've had a lot of really great questions. A couple of things in the chat box. Wayne put in here, Lily Johnson is doing some graduate research, working on who, what, why, where of wool production. And we invite you to copy that out of the chat box and participate in that. Also, if you want to be a part of our regular goat and sheep listserv, please send an email to Wayne Martin. That is also in the chat box. Our next program is going to be held on December 16th. And excuse me while I read this. There was a national needs assessment done by South Dakota State University. And along with our own Dr. Travis Hoffman, there'll be the discussion will determine Minnesota and North Dakota sheep and goat efforts for 2022. So I invite you to wait for that invitation for December 16th. We'll hold that an evening webinar beginning at 6:30. Also, Brenda has put up learning poll here about the webinar. Has it met your expectations? There's 4 questions. We would appreciate that if you would answer those questions before you leave today. And as well, if you have ideas about what we can be doing to educate sheep and goat producers, please include that in the chat box. We certainly appreciate the interaction that we've had with you today. And Brenda, I'm going to give it back to you if you have any more questions or provide a wrap up for today's session.
Thank you, everybody, for attending today. We truly appreciate your time spending with us. A big thank you to our speakers today. And this webinar has been recorded. Once we get it edited, we will send it out in an email. And then also it will be on our YouTube channel, which we provided that link in the chat box. So if you have any questions at any time, feel free to contact me or anybody on our team, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.